Picture a king who reshaped history, a warrior who conquered a nation with an iron will, lying dead in a cathedral as his funeral descends into chaos. What if I told you that William the Conqueror, the man who changed England forever, had a send-off so shocking it was whispered about for centuries, that his body, once feared by armies, became the center of a bizarre ritual that ended in an explosive disaster? You're about to dive into a story that's equal parts grim, absurd, and unforgettable, a tale of power, betrayal, and a funeral unlike any other. Stay with me, because this is going to blow your mind. Let's step back to 1087 in the heart of Normandy. William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, is dead at 59. He's a legend, a man who crossed the English Channel, defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings, and forged a kingdom through sheer determination. But his death wasn't the glorious exit you'd expect. It was messy, undignified, and surrounded by whispers of divine judgment. Growing up, I always imagined William as this unstoppable force, the guy who built the Tower of London and reshaped medieval Europe. But when I stumbled across the story of his funeral, I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a footnote, it was a spectacle that revealed the raw, human side of a larger-than-life figure. William's story begins in 1028 in Falaise, Normandy. Born the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I and a tanner's daughter named Herleva, he was mocked as William the Bastard by his enemies. But illegitimacy didn't stop him. By age 8, he inherited his father's duchy, surviving a childhood filled with assassination attempts and rival nobles. His early years were a masterclass in resilience. Think of a medieval underdog story where a scrappy kid rises to power through grit and cunning. By his 20s, William was a seasoned warrior, uniting Normandy and setting his sights on England. His victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is the stuff of legend, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry. He didn't just conquer a kingdom, he transformed it, introducing Norman laws, castles, and a feudal system that shaped England for centuries. But William's life wasn't all triumphs. By 1087, he was a king worn down by constant rebellion and war. His health was failing, and his once lean frame had grown heavy. He'd spent years fighting to keep England and Normandy under control, battling his own sons who rebelled against him and fending off threats from France. His final campaign was against King Philip I of France, who mocked William's weight, calling him a pregnant woman. Enraged, William led a raid on Mantes, a French town, in the summer of 1087. During the siege, he was injured. Some say his horse reared, slamming him against the saddle's pommel. The injury, likely a ruptured intestine, was agonizing. William retreated to Rouen, where he lingered for weeks, his condition worsening. As death approached, William faced his mortality with a mix of defiance and regret. He was a devout Christian, but his life was stained with blood, massacres, harsh laws, and the brutal harrying of the North, where he'd starved thousands to crush rebellion. On his deathbed, he confessed his sins, distributing wealth to churches and freeing prisoners. He named his second son, William Rufus, as heir to England, while his eldest, Robert Curthose, got Normandy. It was a calculated move to keep his empire intact, but it also sowed division. His third son, Henry, received only money, a decision that would spark future conflicts. William died on September 9, 1087, in a priory outside Rouen, his final words a plea for divine mercy. You'd think the death of a king like William would lead to a grand, solemn funeral, right? But what happened next was anything but dignified. His body was transported to Sens, to the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, a church he'd founded. This is where the story takes a wild turn. In medieval Europe, preparing a body for burial was a serious affair, steeped in ritual. Nobles were often embalmed, their organs removed and preserved to ensure a proper send-off. But William's status as a conqueror didn't spare him from chaos. His court, sensing the power vacuum, scattered. Servants looted his chamber, leaving his body unattended. Imagine that. A king who'd once commanded armies, abandoned in death, his possessions stripped by opportunists. The journey to Caen was no better. William's body, bloated from illness and the summer heat, began to decompose. Medieval chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis describe a gruesome scene. The king's corpse, swollen and discolored, was barely contained by the cart carrying it. By the time it reached the abbey, the stench was unbearable. This wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a scandal. In the 11th century, a king's funeral was a public statement of power. A decaying body was seen as a sign of divine displeasure, a bad omen for the realm. For a man who'd spent his life building a legacy, this was a humiliating blow. At the abbey, the funeral preparations were rushed. The clergy, led by the Bishop of Évreux, tried to maintain decorum, but the situation was spiraling. William's body was too large for the stone sarcophagus prepared for him, a detail that chroniclers noted with grim fascination. The tomb, carved for a younger, leaner William, couldn't accommodate his swollen corpse. This wasn't just a practical issue, it was symbolic. William, the man who'd forced England to bend to his will, was now at the mercy of his own mortality. The monks, desperate to proceed, attempted to force the body into the sarcophagus, and that's when disaster struck. Here's where the explosive part comes in. As the monks pushed and prodded, William's bloated abdomen, filled with gases from decomposition, ruptured. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing decades later, described a horrific scene. A foul stench filled the church, driving mourners outside. The clergy tried to continue the service, burning incense to mask the odor, but it was no use. The funeral, meant to honor a conqueror, became a spectacle of decay. For a modern audience, especially Americans who love a good twist in their historical dramas, this is the kind of moment that sticks with you. A mix of shock, disgust, and dark humor. But the chaos didn't end there. During the service, a local man named Asselin, claiming ownership of the abbey's land, interrupted the proceedings. He argued that William had seized his family's property to build the church, and he demanded compensation. This was unheard of, a commoner disrupting a royal funeral. The clergy, already rattled, had to pause the ceremony to negotiate. They paid Asselin to quiet him, but the damage was done. The funeral, already marred by the body's rupture, was now tainted by public scandal. For a king who'd ruled through fear, this was a final indignity. Let's step back and unpack why this happened. Medieval funerals were more than ceremonies, they were performances of power. A king's body was a symbol of his reign, and its treatment reflected his legacy. William's funeral was a perfect storm of bad timing, poor planning, and cultural beliefs. Decomposition was a practical issue, but it was also a spiritual one. The church taught that a corrupted body could signal a corrupted soul, and William's enemies seized on this. Chroniclers like Wace, writing in Norman French, suggested the funeral was God's judgment for William's sins, his conquests, his taxes, his ruthless campaigns. For a devout society, this was a powerful narrative. Yet, there's another layer to this story: the bizarre ritual itself. The attempt to force William's body into the sarcophagus wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a broader medieval obsession with proper burial. Kings were often buried in churches they'd founded, their tombs serving as eternal propaganda. William's abbey in Sens was a testament to his piety and power, but the rushed burial undermined that. The monks' decision to press on, despite the body's condition, reflects the pressure to uphold tradition. They couldn't delay the funeral. Too much was at stake politically. William's sons were already jockeying for power, and Normandy was on the brink of chaos. The ritual, meant to cement his legacy, instead exposed its fragility. For an American audience, this story resonates on multiple levels. We're drawn to tales of larger-than-life figures brought low by human flaws. Think of political scandals or celebrity meltdowns. William's funeral is like a medieval version of a tabloid headline, exposing the gap between a king's image and reality. But it's also a reminder of how fragile power is. William spent his life building an empire, only to have his final moment defined by chaos. It's the kind of twist that makes history feel alive, not just a dusty textbook chapter. Let's talk about the people around William, because they're key to understanding this moment. His wife, Matilda of Flanders, had died 4 years earlier, leaving him without a stabilizing force. Matilda was a formidable queen, managing Normandy while William conquered England. Her absence at his death left a void, with no one to oversee the funeral's logistics. His sons, meanwhile, were more concerned with their inheritance than their father's dignity. William Rufus rushed to England to claim the crown, while Robert Curthos stayed in Normandy, plotting his next move. Henry, the youngest, was left to navigate the fallout. The lack of family unity was stark, and it contributed to the funeral's disarray. The clergy, too, played a role. The Bishop of Évreux, leading the service, was caught between duty and disaster. Medieval bishops were political figures as much as spiritual ones, and the pressure to maintain order was immense. The monks tasked with preparing the body were likely overwhelmed. Embalming techniques existed, but they were crude, involving herbs, salt, and sometimes organ removal. William's wealth could have ensured a better process, but the haste, driven by political instability, left no time for care. The result was a ritual that failed on every level, turning a sacred moment into a grim farce. This brings us to the cultural context. In 11th century Europe, death was ever present. Disease, war, and short lifespans made funerals a constant reality. But for a king, the stakes were higher. William's conquest of England had made him a polarizing figure. To his Norman followers, he was a hero, uniting two realms. To the Anglo-Saxons, he was a tyrant, responsible for their subjugation. His funeral became a stage for these tensions. The interruption by Asselin, the local claimant, wasn't just a legal dispute. It was a symbolic act of resistance. It showed that even in death, William couldn't escape the consequences of his reign. For Americans, this story taps into our love of irony. We're a culture that celebrates rags to riches tales, but also relishes when the mighty fall. William's journey from the bastard to the conqueror is inspiring, but his funeral reminds us that no one escapes fate. It's like watching a blockbuster where the hero's victory is undercut by a tragic twist. The explosive element, his body's rupture, adds a visceral shock that makes the story stick. It's gross, sure, but it's also human. Even kings bloat and decay, and that universality bridges the gap between 1087 and today. What about the aftermath? William's funeral didn't end his legacy, but it shaped how he was remembered. His son's rivalry plunged England and Normandy into turmoil. William Rufus faced rebellions, while Robert's mismanagement of Normandy led to his eventual imprisonment. Henry, the overlooked son, emerged as the ultimate winner, seizing both realms. The abbey in Sayn, despite the funeral's chaos, became a pilgrimage site, housing William's tomb. Over time, his grave was disturbed, first by French rebels in the 16th century who scattered his bones, and later during the French Revolution. Today, only a single thigh bone remains, a stark reminder of the funeral's grim legacy. The story also raises questions about medieval beliefs. The idea that a botched funeral signaled divine wrath lingered in chronicles. Writers like Orderic Vitalis used it to critique William's reign, framing his death as a cautionary tale. But they also acknowledged his achievements, his laws, his castles, his unification of England. This duality makes William a fascinating figure. He was both a visionary and a tyrant, a man who built an empire but couldn't control his final moment. For a modern audience, especially in Europe and America, this complexity is compelling. We love characters who defy easy labels, from historical giants to fictional anti-heroes. Let's zoom out and reflect. William's funeral wasn't just a one-off disaster. It was a window into a world where power, faith, and mortality collided. The bizarre ritual, forcing a bloated body into a too-small tomb, reveals the desperation to uphold tradition in a time of crisis. It's a story that challenges us to think about legacy. William spent his life conquering, but in death, he was powerless. For Americans, this hits a nerve. We're a nation obsessed with success, but we also grapple with what it means to leave a mark. William's story is a reminder that even the greatest achievements can be overshadowed by a single, chaotic moment. If you're as gripped by this as I am, here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment below and tell me, what shocked you most about William's funeral? Was it the body's rupture, the looted chamber, or Asselin's bold interruption? And if you're hungry for more wild historical tales, stories of kings, rebels, and secrets buried by time, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what's next. Speaking of which, check out our upcoming video, How Cesare Borgia's Poisonous Schemes Made Him the Most Feared Man in Italy. It's a dark, twist-filled journey you'll love. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep digging into history, keep questioning, and let's uncover the past together.